The Seventh Tower by Garth Nix. Book 5, Into Battle. Chapter 14. Whatever had swooped in and eaten them accelerated away so swiftly that Tal momentarily blacked out. Then he started to struggle, punching wildly and kicking until Adras joined in to help and made it too difficult. In his initial panic, Tal hadn't looked around. Now he saw that they were still in the creature's mouth. Whatever it was didn't seem bothered by the heat, possibly because the armor was totally surrounded by ash swallowed at the same time. Tal tried to sit up, but fell over as their swallower suddenly tilted one way and then the other. It felt like it was still moving very quickly, though it was hard to tell from inside. "At least it hasn't swallowed," Tal said after a while. It was still impossible to sit up. They'd twice flipped over completely, and if he hadn't been cushioned by Adras, Tal would have been seriously bruised inside the armor.
"I want to get out,"
replied Adras.
"Out of the monster, out of the armor, out!"
"So do I," said Tal. He thought furiously. What was the story Mila had told him about Ula Strongarm when she was swallowed by a broken-jawed Selski? She'd cut herself out of the Selski's stomach, but he didn't have a sword. Maybe he could burn his way out. Tal started swimming through the ash to reach the side or the floor of the creature's mouth. But every time he got close, there was nothing to hang on to, and the next sudden swerve or turn threw him back where he started, suspended in the middle. Then Tal saw two protruding bulbs of flesh at the rear of the mouth. They were about as big as he was. Though they were constantly quivering, he could at least try and hold on to them. They weren't tonsils, but Tal thought they might be the monster's equivalent. If he could tickle them, or annoy them, or burn them, the monster might throw up. "Let's grab whatever they are and see what happens," he said, and pointed. A moment later he was hurled across the mouth by a sudden zigzag, but Adras got the message. Together they struggled to swim across to the fleshy appendages. It was a case of 2 strokes forward and 1 fall back, but finally they were close enough. Tal hesitated. For a fleeting moment he wondered if it could get any worse. Then he embraced the closer appendage with his now black-hot arms. It wriggled and shook as Tal held it, but the exposed gray-blue flesh didn't seem to burn. He gripped it tighter and tried to throw himself backward and forward, but it was like holding onto a tree trunk in a gale. It went wherever it wanted to, and Tal only just managed to hang on. Then the mouth opened a fraction, and a fresh current of ash swept through the mouth. Tal shouted in triumph and prepared to let go so they could get vomited out. But the monster didn't vomit. The mouth snapped open wide, and a huge wave of ash came crashing in. Tal was picked up and hurled past the tonsil things and down a tunnel that was all too gullet-like. Halfway along, the suit was gripped by a tremendous suction and fired like a spitball down a tube. Tal and Adras were twisted and turned and spun about so Tal could hardly see where they were. They exploded out into a large chamber that Tal guessed was the creature's stomach. It was only half full of ash and crystal, and besides Tal and Adras in the armor, there were several things floating on the surface. Things that had obviously once enjoyed some sort of life in the lake. 2 long gray tendrils came out of the stomach wall, reached down, and picked up a big chunk of what looked like a curfer. The tendrils held it above the ash, while another thicker tendril moved across it, coating it with a sticky yellow substance. Then the first 2 tendrils shoved the curfer tidbit hard against the stomach wall. A tiny hole there expanded to admit the chunk. The tendrils pushed it in, and the hole snapped shut. "I feel sick," said Tal. The tendrils swooped back down. They almost touched Tal, but recoiled at the last moment. The 3rd tendril hovered close, but it didn't touch the suit or spew forth any of the yellow mucus. Then the suction started again. Ash rose up all around Tal and Adras, almost pure ash without the crystals that made it more see-through. The ash coated the suit's helmet so they couldn't see at all. A second later, Tal was slammed down one end of the suit as it was gripped in a mighty suction. The suction increased. The suit was being buffeted, and Tal shook around like a pea in a pod as they accelerated. There was an explosion that deafened Tal and rattled his teeth, and they spun end over end before coming to a crashing halt that would probably have killed Tal if Adras hadn't spread around him and cushioned the blow. After a few seconds of wondering what in the name of light had just happened, Tal wiped the front of the helmet to clear the ash. After a few wipes, he had it clear enough to see that they had collided with a huge block of stone. They were out of the monster, free and clear in the lake. Tal closed his eyes and breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't how Ula's Strongarm would have done it, and it wasn't the stuff of legend, but he didn't care. He looked up at the stone. It was smaller than the bridge pylons, but it was shaped stone, and it went straight up. It was probably the foundation of a chosen house. "Let's climb up and see where we are," he said to Adras. "The sooner we get out of this lake, the better." It was a long climb. Evidently, the creature that had swallowed them was a denizen of the deepest part of the lake. It was a nervous climb, too. Tal found that it took all his willpower to concentrate on the climb and not look over his shoulder every few minutes. He kept expecting to see the shadow of those giant jaws. What if the thing decided to keep them next time? By the time they reached the top, Tal had almost decided not to go back under again. Whatever the risks of detection, they would leave the suit and sneak along a bridge. Then he would steal a boat and get to the Empress's island. He couldn't face being eaten and ejected by a monster again. But when they got to the top of the stone, Tal discovered that it didn't join a bridge or a house. It just stopped, about half his height below the surface. Tal crouched on top of the stone and looked around. It was still night, which was good. Without having his sunstone accessible to check the time, he had feared it would be past dawn already. The moon had risen, though, and it was 2/3 full and far too bright for comfort. It took him a while to get his bearings. They had been brought by the monster to the other side of the lake, the less inhabited side. There was the main cluster of chosen homes off in the distance, and the big south bridge. There was the east bridge, and the orange common house he knew well. And there, no more than 200 stretches away, was the dark shape of the Empress's island. He could only see the bright pools of light from a few sunstones on it, most on the far side, closer to the main part of the enclave. There were no lights at all on the lakeshore facing Tal. Tal looked at it carefully. There was a time when he would have just headed for it straight away. He was more thoughtful now. Why was the island and the closer shore the only place that wasn't lit up? How was it defended against all the creatures that could crawl up its shores out of the lake?
"Out,"
said Adras, cutting into Tal's thoughts. "Soon, very soon," said Tal. He thought for a moment longer. There was no way he was going to climb back down and walk across the lake bed to the island. They would have to take a chance, even with the moon shining so brightly. "Adras, are you strong enough to fly us both to the island?"
"Yes."
Adras confirmed instantly. Tal worried about that for a moment, since he knew Adras would say anything to get out. "All right, I'm going to open the armor. As soon as I step out, I want you to pick me up and fly me just to the edge of the island. To the edge. Got that?" Adras nodded, pushing Tal's head forward so sharply he nearly cricked his neck. Tal grabbed the violet loop and pulled it, before Adras could nod again.